Alrighty, so I, the laziest boy on the West Coast, did a little science experiment. I couldn't figure out if I should call it science or journalism or statistics or what the right term is, but basically I watched hours and hours of pro tournament matches of SF6 and SF5 and measured certain things during the matches and recorded them. When I made my video about my issues with SF6 in its current state, there's an early segment where I mentioned that, in my view, SF6 is more focused on landing big damaging combos than it is focused on winning via a lot of smaller damage pokes. At least the skew is more offset. I remember James Chen disagreeing and saying that he thought that there are plenty of pokes in SF6, and after my recent complaints about how the dialogue in the FGC is boring because people just, say the same thing over and over rather than doing any interesting analysis, I figured, screw it. I'll do it. Let's do some real analysis with real data. So, my scientific method, my process was, I was going to record every clean hit during a round, as well as the round timer at the end of the round. By this, I mean, if a player killed their opponent in 3 combos, no other strikes landed, no hits, no throws, etc., I would record it as a 3-hit round. The reason I recorded the round timer was just because it was convenient to do so. It was right there at the end, so I might as well record it. It's not related to this theory, but I just thought it might be interesting for some other form of analysis. Now, there are a lot of things that I want to record over many hundreds of rounds, but are just much more difficult to actually measure, like what percentage of health was lost via chip damage in a round, exactly what percentage of overall stage length was traveled via this interaction's corner carry, this block or this combo or whatever, etc. How many seconds of each round do players spend close range, far, outside of Footsie's range, in the corner, in mid-screen, etc. All of these things and more I'd be very interested to collect a ton of data on, but I don't know how to conveniently measure a lot of those looser data points. Even just doing this, I have been working on this project for a week. Dozens of hours of just measuring and recording and measuring and recording. Alright, so this is me pulling up random North America East Top 8 from last year, this Pro Tour, or rather 2022 or whatever. So this is how I would go about it. One hit. One hit. Anything that does real damage, anything that makes real contact, is an actual hit. I'm not including chip damage because I can't measure that.
Never mind, we are not getting the back-to-back matchup, similar matchup here.
Not quite
another
yet,
hit.
Right. We talk about the light buffer.
Another hit.
They're very, very long-reaching standing light kick from Sowwy.
Another hit.
Being able to get some whiff punishes like most characters don't, right? And also a great buffer
another hit
tool as well, just covering so much space. You're gonna need that against someone like Cody, who has pretty sizable
another hit
tools.
Yeah. And honestly,
another hit.
Light kick also just gets her so many more punishes that
another
other
hit.
Characters cannot punish.
Another hit.
Oh, look at this! That's
so in the end, we had Sakura landing 7 hits, Cody landing 3 hits. So then I would record that and here.
Gonna take round up, getting Shine in the corner and just landing
next round.
Pressure.
Hit. Hit.
Shine is
hit.
going with that same
hit.
loadout though, 1 and 2. So
hit.
a nice, oh.
He was ready for the bad spray and he actually got the
hit.
punish. No.
And that's the side switch for Shine. Smart decision on that final fight combo.
Oh, and you
hit.
You tricky man. Activating on the first hit of Zonk instead.
Hit.
Right, but back to the fireball game.
Oh.
Nice backdash, but move recovered that down forward heavy kick recovered fast enough.
Hit.
Oh god.
Look
and
at
I like
this.
Yeah, suppressing the movement against Shine.
Hit.
Oh, the call out. The airborne fireball.
Hit.
The back.
Alright, so that was Sakura landing 8 hits, Cody landing 3. So how many hits it took to kill between those 2 rounds? 7 and then 8. So average 7.5 hits. That is how we would do it, and then we just collect a shitload of fucking match data, and then run the numbers, analyze what's going on. Now, my reasoning behind this scientific process is that I felt like rounds that ended in a fewer total number of damage interactions from the winning player indicated that the round was comprised of more of high damage combos rather than many separate smaller pokes and hits. Now, in retrospect, there are a few flaws to this theory. To a certain degree, rounds ending in fewer hits is an indication of the game's overall damage output. If in SF5 most rounds end in 6 hits from the winning player, and in 6 most rounds end in, say, 5 hits, that might be an indication of that it's prioritizing heavy combos over pokes, but it also could just mean that the damage output is just higher, so less things have to happen. The level of high damage and the frequency in real matches with which very high damage occurs, and the overall damage accumulation of just any interaction. I was actually mistaken in my prior Street Fighter 6 video, where I had said at one point in it, I said that throws do more damage in Street Fighter 6 than they do in SF5. I went back and actually examined the data, and that's actually not true, I've now realized. Everything else in Street Fighter 6 does way more damage than in 5, at least by the end of 5, but throws do not. So, rounds can have a lower number of hits required to kill because of high damage in combos and individual hits and supers and just everything. Rounds can have a high number of hits from the winning player for various reasons. Sometimes the players just make mistakes. They drop killing combos. They hit suboptimal conversions. Scramble situations can result in a lot of loose blows that don't lead to much reward. Certain characters are just lower damage than others, or otherwise more prone to doing smaller damage actions a lot in a round. The data I collected was all from Capcom Pro Tour events. I collected many hours of matches from the recent 2 months of the SF6 Pro Tour, and for the SF5 video content, I studied matches from the last few months of that game's final Pro Tour, including Capcom Cup. So, many things can mess with these numbers, right? If I happen to watch more Dhalsim matches in SF5, then the number of hits will be higher because each round will have so many individual small pokes adding smaller amounts of damage. If players make mistakes and scramble more separate hits will happen. I figured that if I collect it from the Pro Tour, it will overall result in a mostly accurate assessment of the current meta of the game as defined by the people at its highest level, and the final established meta of SF5, which was very set in stone by the end of its lifespan. If there are more Dhalsim matches, thus those matches tend to increase the numbers if the Dhalsim player wins the round, it probably means that Dhalsim was a strong character by the end of SF5, and thus it is an accurate representation of the game's overall final meta that it represented Dhalsim more prominently, thus it's a level of damage output and how many hits each round takes to close out, generally speaking. One flaw with this reasoning is SF6 is a new game, and SF5, by the end of it, was very, very, very firmly established. Every strong player was playing like a well-oiled machine by the end of SF5, so the damage was optimized, the damage optimization was higher, the mistakes were much fewer, the meta was stronger, people knew exactly what to do and how to get their win conditions, how to get the damage they needed. Do I think that the players just being better at SF5 because they played it for 6 years, do I think that that resulted in SF5 unfairly having a lower hit count per round or having a higher hit count per round? Well, more optimal players will of course hit harder and clean out rounds without wasting damage. So common sense would say lower number of hits per round. Number of openings required to get the kill, but perhaps stronger and more optimal players are also better at eking every bit of value from each situation and thus getting smaller whiff punishes, or using more risk-averse tools that yield less reward, more consistent, smaller damage. Is that possible? Perhaps. Overall, I would say, after watching hours and hours of both games this past week, I'd say the damage and situational optimization is more important. So, by my count, for SF5, it skews a bit lower than it should just because the players are better at playing the game perfectly. And more so, this speaks to SF6, which I observed many times. If a round ended in a higher number of total hits, often, over 50% of the time, it was because the players were making errors and dropping shit and scrambling, and thus dropping things when they could have actually closed it out in just like 5 hits or 6 hits. The other fact is, of course, I'm comparing first version SF6 with the final version of SF5. SF5, of course, gradually lowered the overall game's damage output throughout the years. V-Trigger Cancel added damage scaling, Crush Counter got damage scaling, Crush Counter buttons, most of the good ones, all got nerfed in terms of what conversions they allowed, like Urian's uncharged Stand Fierce, etc., made more whiff punishable. The game improved in ways that made it more playable, like removing the input delay and adding hurt boxes and stuff to some of those crush counter moves or whatever that made them more risky and thus used less frequently. Super crazy shit was nerfed eventually, like Colleen's damage and V-Trigger 2 damage, or just... So, overall, the damage went a lot way down from first version all the way to final version. And defensive mechanics went up, player understanding of how to minimize damage taken improved, etc. All of which resulted in the final version of SF5 having overall lower damage and a lot more separate hits per round. The other thing that unfairly skews this toward SF5 having lower overall number of hits than it ought to, relatively speaking, is the prominence of chip damage. Since I am only including clean hits, not Grey Life, chip damage, or poison, since I have no way to precisely measure how much damage is being lost to those sources by the end of a round, I don't include them in this study, which naturally lends to lowering the SF5 clean hits number more so than the SF6 one, because in SF5, more rounds are affected by chip damage, obviously, since it's constantly occurring. And if they lose 20% of their overall life to chip damage in a round, and from chip and Grey Life, and I'm not even measuring that, that means that the player who beat them needed even fewer openings and clean hits to deal the other remaining 80% of their life. Chip damage is only sometimes a significant factor in SF6 rounds. So, hundreds and hundreds of rounds later, my overall average that I got for the number of hits it took for the winner to kill in a round for SF5 was 7.36, roughly. The average for SF6 was 6.429. The median for SF5 was 7 hits. The median for SF6 was 6 hits. Keep in mind that this is conservative for SF5 because a significant chunk of life is lost every round via Grey Life and chip damage. More than you realize. If you measure like a Fong round, he usually has a higher than average number of hits per round than other characters because he's constantly tagging people with small little damage checks that he can't convert from. Like if he's doing his block strings, he does like crouch, medium kick, stand jab, stand fierce. If they try to jump out of the stand jab, stand fierce, they get clipped by the stand jab but not the fierce because it doesn't combo. So he's constantly tagging people with little hits that he can't convert from. And just, you know, or getting trades with the poison balls or Ryobenda or his anti-airs or whatever. But some Fong rounds actually have a significantly lower number of total hits than his normal rounds if they are slow and patient rounds where there's a lot of blocking involved by both players. And in those ones, like 40% of the life is done via Grey Life, chip damage, and poison by the end of it. As for the mode, and forgive me, it's been a while since I took middle school math class to explain what the fuck a mode is, but in terms of the mode of the numbers, the stories are a bit more complex. A bit more interesting. Basically, in SF6, most rounds end in 5 to 7 hits, okay? Discounting rounds where not every round will use a level 3 super, right? So most rounds end in 5, 6, or 7 hits. Any character is capable of ending the round in 4 hits and not in a particularly uncommon fashion. The rounds that have a higher number than that are almost always either the result of a specific matchup and characters getting hit by individual fireballs in neutral. Usually not normal pokes, okay? Like JP standing medium punch or Luke standing medium kick. Those do occur, but most quote-unquote pokes, like individual hits, come from fireballs. From Chun or Luke or whatever. Or people making mistakes and playing in a way that is not really optimizing their damage output. Scrambles, dropping shit, pressing buttons that don't lead to much, not out of a sense of any control, weak conversions, etc., that thus make the rounds last longer and take more hits to close out. In SF5, Luke and Bison, out of the characters that out of the matches I measured, Luke and Bison were the characters that usually had the lowest hits per round. Maybe Ed. Luke, Bison, and then Ed was like number 3 for characters that were consistently ending rounds in 6 or 7 hits. So the characters with the highest damage output relative to the ease of which their openings and the capacity to base their entire game plan around landing consistently decent or strong damage. The characters with the lowest average numbers usually ended rounds in 6 or 7 hits, so long as a round plays out clean and there aren't a lot of random trades and unusual awkward shit happening. In SF6, Luke and Marisa have the lowest average hits per round. They usually end things in 4 to 6 hits. Again, barring any overall sloppiness. And with some inconsistencies, again, Luke matches, a lot of them end in 4 to 6 hits, but then some of them get up to like 7 or 8 or sometimes 9 if they use a lot of fireball or something, or just a lot of other pokes, or a lot of throws in the corner, because throws do less damage than everything else. I recorded hundreds of matches for both games, and almost none of the SF5 rounds, almost none, less than 5% of the rounds ended in 4 hits. If someone got steamrolled or robbed by a Laura player or something, that was almost always 5 hits, at least. Usually exactly 5 hits for some robbery round. There was one single round that I recorded from all the matches I watched of SF5 Pro Tour that ended in 3 hits, and that was from a Cody player. In SF6, 4-hit rounds are common enough for the really strong damage-dealing characters like Luke and Marisa and whatever. 3-hit rounds are still uncommon, but not exceedingly rare. The reason why the average I got for SF6 was 6.4 and not something lower is simply because the game is still fresh and the play is still sloppy, and a lot of rounds get an unnecessarily number of extra random little ticks here and there. The characters who usually had the highest number of hits per round as a matter of character and not awkward mistakes by the players were Guile. Guile was the highest, consistently the highest. Dalsim actually was actually lower than Guile. Dalsim, he needed fewer total hits to win a round, whereas Guile is constantly landing his individual medium kicks, his Sobots and crouch medium kick, and his anti-air medium kick and whatever, and just individual sonic booms that don't lead to combos. Some characters are a mixed bag, like JP and Chun-Li, for instance. Both characters have the capacity to fairly easily get extremely high damaging combos and just brutally kill their opponents in 3 or 4 hits. Both Chun-Li and JP have plenty of rounds that end in 4 hits, but both characters also have an array of very strong, low damage options as well that they might use in certain matchups. So a JP round might be 4 hits if he lands his high damage all the time, or it might be 10 hits because he keeps landing individual spikes or ghosts while he's zoning. Fireballs were the main thing that would take characters who can end rounds in a small number of hits and then raise that number from 4 hits to like 8 or 9 hits for a round. So Chun, Ken, Ryu, Luke, etc. But Luke Luke had that capacity, but usually Luke was killing in 5 or 6 hits. Or 4, 5, or 6. So yeah. That 6.4 average, once the highest level of play is cleaner and more consistent and optimal, that number is fucking going down even further. You have to understand, that 6.4 to SF5's 7.2, that's not just a small 0.8 difference, and even then, a 1-point difference is significant when you're talking about numbers this small. If you just watch the matches like I did for hours on end, you would notice how many smaller damage things occur in SF5 than do in SF6. How few hits each round ends in SF6 unless some sloppiness happens. Only particularly degenerate rounds in SF5 end in 5 hits or 4 hits in rare circumstances. At the pro level I'm talking about. In SF6, it is incredibly common that rounds end in 4 or 5 hits. Very fucking common that people just get hit bad. The most common numbers were 5, 6, and 7. Like, if you just look at the mode, and then you consider the biases and the outliers, the math just makes it clear how much more fucking damage that you're doing in 6 than you were in 5. In terms of my observations and analysis from all the data that I collected in the matches that I studied, one thing to note is that SF6 rounds are more inconsistent than SF5 ones, and that's obvious because of, not just because of that I was recording it from SF5 rounds after the game was optimized to fuck and everyone was already very consistent at it, but it's also because of how the resources are distributed. If you compare one combo in SF6 to a combo in SF5, some of them you might think that they look like similar damage if you're looking at the most damaging combos in SF5. But you need to remember a few things. One, the frequency with which these very high damage things are actually landed in actual real high-level matches. And two, in SF6, the final combo of a round deals extra damage sometimes because you can dump all your drive gauge into one big combo at the end. And three, because supers are separate from drive gauge, you're more likely to have big damage combos with also supers tacked on at the end that cut through the damage scaling of your final combo, thus overall resulting in rounds ending in fewer total hits. And the combination of the resources of drive gauge plus super ultimately deal more damage than in SF5 the combination of V-trigger plus meter. Sometimes rounds in SF5 would end in fewer hits because a super was used, but not very commonly, because most meter was spent on EX moves, not supers. The meta by the end of SF5 was less reliant on V-trigger for pure damage. A lot of the top tiers by the end of the game had V-triggers that didn't yield like insane combo damage and were more valuable for their functional control of a match. Also, the really insane V-triggers in the game just got nerfed over the years through damage reductions and adding the V-shift and to deal with excess pressure and shit. A phenomenon that I noticed throughout this process was that, say, Ken in SF6. Ken in SF6 has some high combo damage, some of the highest corner damage in the entire game. High damage, low meter or metered corner meaty setups, etc. High damage DI combo in the corner, etc. But the way people play Ken and just the nature of his toolset, the opponents play against Ken, it means that he actually had a higher average number of hits per round, significantly higher than, say, Luke. Because, like, not just because Luke does more damage, but, like, you do one hit to do a combo into Run Tatsu to take the opponent to the corner. Now, Run Tatsu is a low damage combo, honestly. It's used for its corner carry. So, unlike other characters, like Luke is doing massive damage and then maybe into an Oki setup, Ken has to choose between damage and corner carry. And then he gets more throws in the corner than any other character, Ken does. He has strong lights, and he uses them often, and has a lot of moves that hit just once, like Fireball, or the Shin Kick from Jinrai Pressure, Step Kick, etc., controlling tools in neutral that often don't yield combos if they're not counter hit or punish counter or at the right spacings or whatever. Killing people with throws in SF6 actually takes a lot of throws, a lot of interactions. I observed that way more throws were landed in SF5 matches than in SF6 matches. My guess as to why that is that strike damage is higher and more worth going for in SF6, and making them block your buttons is good for building your own drive gauge and reducing theirs, okay? And going for throws is risky because of the extra recovery in SF6. Also, players in SF5 were very willing to take throws, so it was a very consistent source of damage. They were very willing to take throws, especially in mid-screen, since there was no Oki. Whereas in SF6, because of Drive Rush, a lot of throws in mid-screen just give Oki anyways, so players are often sometimes, the value of throw is reduced because the damage is not comparable to the strike damage, the risk may be higher, you don't want to give up control, and players are more active on defense in SF6, so it's less consistent to find people just constantly taking throws. At least outside of the corner, once they get very risky. Anyways, so yeah, it's also just harder to walk forward, so if you're not quite in throw range, it's riskier to walk forwards to get into throw range and then throw them in SF6, because you risk more damage by walking into a medium button buffered into Drive Rush than you did in SF5, walking forwards into, like, a jab. Another thing that I noticed was that there were a lot more hits from random individual jabs in SF5, just trading jabs, or just one jab here in neutral that clips a limb and doesn't convert to anything. Overall, light buttons in general were much, much stronger in SF5 than in SF6, so this makes perfect sense to me. Lights in SF6 have much worse hurt boxes, and they are not plus on block, so it's often not very valuable to throw them out just to occupy space as a poke and try to clip a button or check the opponent, and they won't give you advantage on block, so you can't do a sequence incredibly safely of a light to a medium. And also, the risk of getting clipped by a button into Drive Rush and eating 40% of your fucking life is much worse than the threat of getting, like, a low forward into a knockdown special that you would get in Street Fighter V. That's the major thing, is that damage from pressure, it was consistent or equal to how between like SF5 and SF6, but damage from neutral is much higher in SF6, because if you get clipped by some Drive Rush button forwards, like Luke Drive Rush Crouch Strong, or Drive Rush Suppressor, or JP Drive Rush Crouch Strong, and its fucked up hurt box makes it beat your attempt to check the Drive Rush, and then he can hit confirm that into another medium, into another Drive Rush, 4 bars, and he does like this combo that takes 40% of your life, right? So, or just getting clipped by any buffer, like Crouch Strong, buffer into Drive Rush, and you lose 40% of your life as well. The damage output that you constantly risk from even just small minor hits and interactions, any medium or heavy, and you lose so much of your fucking life in SF6 compared to the damage that you are more likely to lose from neutral interactions in SF5, huge difference. Another observation having to do with lights is in SF5, lights aren't so bad even if you get whiff punished because they are so fast, and unless the button you are hit with is single hit confirmable, there's not enough time, a lot of the time, for the player to recognize that they whiff punished you and then cancel it into a special or like a target combo or something. But in SF6, the neutral is less about hit confirming strikes and more about people throwing out mediums or heavies into Drive Rush just to do it. And whether or not they are doing that is more a matter of meter management than it is confirming. So people constantly do medium button, buffer into Drive Rush if they're in range. It fucks with my numbers a bit, which I notice because it depends on how willing the player is to just do button into Drive Rush on block. Because if, say, in terms of the data that I recorded in observing these matches, if, say, a Luke player just does walk up, stand fierce into Drive Rush in neutral, they can't confirm that. It's not a single hit confirmable button, so they are just committing to it. Maybe it hits on hit, maybe the opponent is just blocking when it connects. Okay? So if they were just blocking, and the Luke does stand fierce Drive Rush, and then they just go into like crouch jab or crouch strong or something, go for a throw attempt, the throw gets teched, there's 0 true hits, and no one lose any health for that interaction. No one takes any damage in that interaction, so I don't record it, even though they spent half their meter on it. Versus if they do that constantly, and sometimes the Stand Fierce did connect on hit, just randomly, again, it's not a hit confirm, they're just doing it. If they did get lucky enough that it was on hit, then they're doing shitloads of damage in a single combo, okay? So players that are more willing to just gamble their drive gauge on something that they cannot hit confirm as a drive rush cancel, throw off my numbers a bit more, because it means that their combos on landing are more likely to be high damage, and thus end rounds in a fewer number of hits. But again, this is also just the way the game is played. It's also just how the game makes sense to play, because it's so rewarding when it works out. So, yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention, another time in SF6 when the strike number for a round gets unusually higher than average is when someone gets into burnout and they attempt to avoid burnout pressure by trying to hold up, and they keep getting clipped by a bunch of different single hits over and over. Like, someone tries to jump out of Manon just hitting Stand Strong over and over. Then they're getting a bunch of individual hits that aren't going into combos, but are still keeping them locked down. So, like I mentioned, in SF6, the hit number can fluctuate a bit based on resource spending. Drive gauge, how they play with their drive gauge, their luck factor for when they swing, and whether when they do unconfirmable things, whether it happened to be on hit or on block. And if someone winds up in the right situation to get a hit confirm, they confirm into doing some optimal combo with all the remaining drive gauge and then into a level 3 or something. Most of the time, those rounds are ending in 4 hits. Rounds with level 3s used at the end usually end in 4 hits, sometimes 3. Sometimes people just wind up with excess damage, like they get a hit that they need, but their opponent is almost dead anyways, so they landed a combo that they could have converted into like 50% damage, but the opponent only has 10% health left, and thus, you know, wasted damage on the table that they didn't necessarily need. So they could have done a more optimal combo if... So, theoretically, if you had cut out a lot of the previous confirms or sources of damage, you could have ended the round in fewer hits. And as players get better at orchestrating their own win conditions, this will improve and those numbers will also go down. Another silly thing that I noticed is that in SF6, more aggressive Oki usually results in more hits per round. Normal throw from most characters, some especially, like Kimberly's throw damage is much lower than the rest of the cast. Normal throw just deals so much less damage than the stuff that deals stupid high damage. So, throw loops will always add a larger number of total hits to a round. When you're aggressive, the opponents in these matches are like locking up and turtling, and the next hit that you land usually won't be some clean, huge 40% damage combo. This is also just based on how, like, the buttons that you do on pressure in Street Fighter 6 don't convert on hit in the same way that they did in Street Fighter 5, where every medium button was like +9 on hit in 5. So in this game, rather, when a player did like the Luke thing of just mash crouch strong and neutral until it buffers into drive rush on like a dash check or whatever, or clipping a limb or clipping a drive rush, they do a huge 35% combo. Then, just take really light Oki into like a meaty fireball or something, and then back off and just play neutral again. What happens when the Luke player does that is that because the match goes back to neutral and it slows down, one, both players get their drive gauge back. Unless they're dealing with a lot of fireball shenanigans that keep them blocking or parrying shit, but that usually means that, like, say, Luke versus Chun, right? The Luke player gets a crouch strong buffer, takes 40% of the life, then goes back to playing neutral. Both players are getting their drive gauge back and waiting, which means that the next interaction, not only will it also probably be one of those neutral interactions that instantly yield another 40% damage, it'll probably be another crouch strong buffer, but also, because you went passive instead of aggressive, both players, over that period of time until the next thing occurs, get more drive gauge to work with, and thus have more meter to work with when the next hit occurs. That's another reason that Ken players, I find, have a higher number of total hits per round to get the kill. Because they take Oki very aggressively, and the next hit that they land after they do like their big corner combo, whatever, the next hit that they land and confirm, other than just throw loops in the corner, the next hit that they land and confirm as a strike into a combo is usually crouch jab, stand jab, uppercut, or some variation of a light conversion like that. This also speaks to the weird thing in this game and how it differs from SF5, which is, in SF5, like I said, your big damage usually comes from getting good counter hits. You gotta be closer to your opponent and hit them with a good fucking counter hit move that if you get a counter hit, you can then confirm it into big damage. So you walk up with, like, Karen, you get close enough, you get counter hit crouch strong, you see the counter hit, it lets you link into stand fierce, and then you do stand fierce into EX shoulder, and the rest of the combo, you're doing a lot of damage. That's a strong conversion, okay? In SF6, your big damage comes from the literal opposite of that. The closer you are to the opponent, the worse your conversions are from things that you can confirm or things that you can pressure with, because the only things that are safe on block or plus on block in rare circumstances like Kent or like Luke crouch strong is you can do stuff that's like built in that is a bit of a commitment, like Ken Jinrai kicks or whatever, or you can do lights with most characters to like confirm, and lights are going to produce low damage conversions, and yeah, so that's just what happens, is that when you're closer to the opponent, even if you land, like say Luke in Street Fighter 6, if he does walk up crouch strong, unless you're fucking god tier, because crouch strong from Luke, technically within the range of human reactions to single hit confirm. Very difficult though, not as loose as Karen's. I think, I have no basis for this, but I think based on my attempts to do it, it feels like it's around 15 frames. So, assuming that you can't do it, because I've never seen a player consistently do it in a match, including pro players, assuming that that's not a thing that's done, let's say Luke is walking towards the opponent, what are his options to convert into big damage if he's within crouch strong range? If he lands a crouch strong and it gets a counter hit, crouch strong is normally +5 in this game for Luke. On counter hit, it goes to +7. What does he have that's 7 frames that will actually reach past the fucking pushback that crouch strong gets, okay? If he's close enough, he could get crouch strong, which is better than most characters get in terms of counter hit conversions. But, especially since crouch strong is plus, so Luke is much more blessed than most of the cast in terms of that. But, if he's not in the range to get 2 crouch strongs in a row, what can he get? Nothing. He gets crouch strong counter hit, and then he confirms into fucking standing medium kick, which doesn't cancel into anything, okay? If you're in range for your moves, it is harder to confirm into big damage. If you're out of range and getting reactional checks and buffers, okay, you just hit the button and buffer it from outside of range, that's when you're consistently landing your highest damage in Street Fighter 6. For a lot of characters, for the strong characters, for most characters. Okay, to illustrate this point, let me quickly try to set up this situation that would represent this. So, if, let's say I throw the opponent does wake up, jab, okay, right? So, in Street Fighter 5, right? In Street Fighter 5, you would get more damage by being closer to the opponent. In generally speaking, in most situations, the closer you are to the opponent and you press your good button that has a good counter hit reward, be it a crush counter or be it just like a medium or something that yields good counter hit reward, that was how you would get more damage. So like in terms of counter hits, let's say if you're this far out and you get it like a counter hit like this, you can only link standing medium kick. But if you're closer, you can link medium punch, medium punch. That was how most Street Fighter V characters work. Every range, the closer you got, there was a better counter hit conversion and a heavier hitting combo that you could get as a result of this. In this game, say you walk up and you throw the opponent, and then as Luke you walk up, and in order to try to stop them from like jumping out, the best you can do is walk up, crouch strong here. You're not close enough for that, which would normally be your optimal meterless off of crouch strong. So you can only get that meterless, or that, which is not bad, honestly. It's not bad for a 1-bar, it's whatever. Pretty solid. Other characters do not have things as good as this, necessarily, a lot of the times. In terms of Dry Brush, you can do that, which is not really any more damage. So actually, technically, if you wanted to spend 5 bars, the optimal would be doing that, which is 2620. So that is damage that you can walk forwards, hit a meaty, and then confirm it. Now, alternatively, if you wanted to go for a meaty after this, you could try to manually time a stand roundhouse. If you get it perfectly timed, this is very valuable, because then you can get a heavy combo on hit, and then you can get, it can be like 0 or whatever on block. So you can get some pretty good stuff if you manually time that as your meaty. However, it's not a predetermined setup. You have to do it just arbitrarily. You could do towards Fierce, which you can single hit confirm into the follow-up. So you don't have to commit to it, and then you can do whatever the conversion is off of it, which is slightly better than doing the walk-up into this. Slightly more damage on hit, however, if the opponent wakes up and blocks after your meaty, your walk-up crouch strong will at least leave you in range where you can do like stand short fireball or something else like that. Whereas if you do forward fierce, you're leaving yourself at -3 in range. And even though this does have a follow-up, there's a 5-frame gap or 4-frame gap in between it, so loses to 4-framers, trades with 5-framers, which means it can be checked almost every time unless you perfect parry their jab or something. So, also not an ideal option. Theoretically, the best option would be the stand roundhouse, because it's less negative and puts you at a less disadvantageous position than doing forward fierce. However, there's a greater likelihood of you making a mistake on it. The other alternative, you can do stand strong from back here. Now that leaves you at -2 if it's on block, at a much greater distance, so you might be in a superior position afterwards, and this is a move that you can single hit confirm into that, which is not very much damage. You could do it into a super. So these are some of your theoretical options for how you would do a meaty to stop the opponent from jumping out, backdashing, or just like hitting a jab. Now, if they do hit a jab on wake up, then you have the options to get counter hit. So what can you get off of counter hit? Luke! Actually not as bad as some other characters in this circumstances. You can do crouch strong, which is already plus on block anyways, and you are close enough to get a counter hit. Pretty good conversion off of that. Pretty respectable damage. I could switch to another character that is not as good at this. What other character would not have as good of a counter hit conversion off of moves that they would do to be plus? I mean, fucking... Okay, so Jury has plenty of moves that are oppressive and plus. Kimberly has good, like block pressure, etc. Other characters are more resource dependent in terms of making their pressure scarier or better conversions, like Lily or etc. JP is a plus on block normal. Cammy is a plus on block normal, etc. So, character dependent. Ken has no plus on block moves, but lots of weird frame traps built into his things and good counter hit conversions. But the point is that overall, in a lot of instances, you don't get your damage from doing a walk-up, counter hit, and then converting that counter hit into something, another link into another normal, which was the main source of damage in Street Fighter 5, okay, by the end of it, or just throughout the entire thing, honestly. So you could do this if there is a counter hit. If there's not a counter hit, your conversions get much shittier. That being said, if he does a wake-up crouch jab, and you beat it by just standing here, hitting crouch strong, and buffering it, and then it just and then since it clips the button, it automatically does it. If you just do this, that's your damage, okay? 3K, 3263, alright, off of that. So that's a buffer that you can do, or if you just commit to doing an action, $3,500. Alright, so the damage you get from being further away from the opponent or otherwise doing things you can't confirm into, the damage you get from your buffers in neutral is higher than the damage you would get from being closer and more aggressive to the opponent. So, your big damage comes from landing buttons from a raw drive rush or otherwise buffering buttons into a drive rush. Or throwing out buttons that you can't confirm within strike range and just drive rush canceling anyways and hoping that you get lucky and that the opponent doesn't block it. Or some auto-confirm things in the game like punish counter funky slicer or something. The point is, okay, like take Luke in the corner. If Luke forward throws you in the corner, his strike Oki is actually pretty weak. He can walk forwards, but not far enough for it to be point blank when he does his meaty strike. The best he can get is walk close enough to get meaty crouch strong, and then on hit, he can link stand short into like EX Flash Knuckle. So, okay damage, could be worse for a confirmable button, but the only way for him to get more damage, really fucked up damage, 35% damage, is on his strike Oki in that situation is if he just raw commits to just doing a button and then canceling it into drive rush without confirming it. The point is, in SF6, being close to the opponent in many circumstances, not all, but many circumstances, makes it more difficult to confirm into your big damage instead of easier, just because of how the buttons are designed. And this has a statistical result in the matches that I observed and documented, where a lot of the rounds that would end in fewer hits, like 4 hits or 5 hits, often did so not because the player was really aggressive with their Oki, but because they just went back to neutral, and then their next hit that they landed happened to be some lucky buffer or some check on a drive rush or something into another huge fucking damage drive rush combo. The observation that matters to me in my original argument is that I feel like everything that I watched from this process shows that I was right, and I am right. SF6 is much more focused about big damage and these long, multi-hit anime combos, okay? Like, just landing a low forward in this game, in SF5, unless you had V-trigger, cancel, things like that, if, like, you're doing Ken, you land low forward, you're just doing uppercut. You're just doing low forward, heavy uppercut, quick, easy, you don't have to waste your fucking life watching some long-ass anime combo. And you're back to playing the game, and it's not too much damage, and it's not enormous amount of corner carry. And in this game, it's much more about big damage and long anime combos than it is about lower damage interactions and individual pokes. At least for damage, okay? Like I said, fireballs rack up a lot of the numbers in this game. A lot of fireballs are not necessarily valuable because of their damage output in this game. Like landing a raw fireball in neutral, not super valuable just because of the damage it deals compared to what you could be doing by landing combos. They're more for control, for fucking with the opponent's drive gauge, creating opportunities to get in or otherwise control the neutral in ways that benefit you and however you want, whatever. Or wasting time and making the opponent deal with something while you regenerate your drive gauge, etc. So anyways, in the SF6 matches, almost every knockdown went into some kind of Oki, whereas in the SF5 matches, a smaller percentage, a significantly smaller percentage of each round was spent with either player in throw range after a hit or something. Combos more consistently have huge corner carry in SF6. Yes, there are some combos in SF5 that have outrageous carry, like Balrog's double EX straight juggles, but in general, real matches, when the real hits were landed in the real matches in SF6, somebody's going into the corner right away, and in SF5, they were not getting pushed back even half as far most of the time. And the pokes. Way more damage and way more control in a match from deliberate small sources. Damage especially. In SF6, most rounds are 6 hits. That's the median. And those usually consist of often, in my observation, usually consist of 2 small combos, 1 bigger combo, 1 harder hitting combo, a throw, and then 2 little random hits, like a random jab or limb that clips something, or maybe an anti-air, okay? In SF5, way more of the damage comes from Grey Life and Chip, obviously, so 20 to 30% from V-Reversal damage, Grey Life, Chip, etc. in a lot of the matches. But also, out of the 7 to 8 hits a round usually takes, it'll have 3 modest combos, very modest combos, just like a low forward into a special, okay? Then 3 throws, a random little jab or 2, and then 1 bigger combo usually, plus a couple of the sources of chip damage. Only high damage characters have rounds end in fewer hits than that in most circumstances. And just because Luke was fucking everywhere by the end of Street Fighter V, and thus he was all over the matches that I was watching, I got more data from his rounds, and thus that is also something, again, I feel it's representative of the state that the game was in, because Luke was the best, and more people played Luke. So that is an accurate representation of what the game was like at that point, but he generally ended rounds in fewer hits than most of the rest of the cast, in 5 and in 6. But, like, when I watch, say, Birdie in SF5, the Birdie matches and stuff, that's when it clicked for me the hardest, and I can really see exactly what I am trying to say. Birdie averaged, like, 9 hits a round. Most of his hits that he's landing are little crouch jabs to control space, single medium pokes, anti-airs, okay, and then maybe, like, 2 medium punch into bullhorn whiff punishes, and then a command grab or 2, and or plus a higher damage V-trigger combo at one point. That's usually what a Birdie round looks like. But that's what I mean. That is a character who, most of the hits that he gets to round are these little pokes. These small little fucking pokes that he's using to control the space. He's mostly getting crouch jabs and like stand strongs and just small whiff punish of just button into knockdown. No one in SF6 plays like that, okay? That's my complaint, is not just this overall design of the game, but also partially that I just don't have a character that I want to play in it. Because no one in SF6 plays like that. No one has some great controlling, safe crouch jab that just checks guys and controls space really well, and just checks a lot of pokes and just lands a lot in a match. No one has like these great pokes that are hard to get past, where the enemy really has to like figure out how to get in. In SF6, a button that you cannot cancel, like a Dulcim limb, is risking DI, okay? In addition to risking perfect parry, like any other button, risking everything else that any button you do is always risking in this game, like a buffer into drive rush, or like a fucking funky slicer, punish counter, or whatever. The risk reward is just much more fucked up because the damage is higher on those options, and the damage is not higher on your little fucking pokes. In addition to the fact that you just don't have great, really controlling safe pokes like you did before. There's no Birdie for me to play in this game, okay? And have people scratch their heads and try to figure out how to out-footsies the crouch jab and the stand strong and whatever and the stand fierce, okay? Chun's stand fierce is like the worst it's ever been. And she's godlike, not because of stand fierce, but because of that she just plays the same way that everyone else plays and just does it really well. It is so fucking easy to get in SF6, so there's less control of space and more just counter violence in space. Fireballs are better in SF6. Fireballs are better and safer just because there's nowhere near as many anti-projectile tools in 6 as 5 had. So fireballs are the only things that constitute strong pokes now. Everything else, the numbers do not lie. The numbers are not lying. The damage is much higher in SF6 compared to much SF5. You lose rounds in fewer interactions constantly. Fucking constantly, okay? If you are not doing massive damage and playing your character in a way in which you are looking for chances to do massive damage, you are only fucking yourself. Now, of course, number of hits to end a round does not account for, say, Kimberly mauling you and landing a lot of hits that are just harder to escape from than the characters that land fewer hits but more damaging hits. I'm not here to suggest or wag my finger about character balance. I always feel in many of these conversations about game design for fighting games that people only come back to character balance, which I don't really care as much about as other players do. I don't think making sure every character is balanced is like the pinnacle of fighting game design. That's not my primary concern. But I'm just delivering my analysis of the data here. It is my personal opinion that the overall design of SF6, it is just my personal opinion that the design has a lot of inconsistency to it. When I see Luke win a round in 3 hits because he was sitting in mid-screen and he just buffered a convenient button at the right time, I feel like that's not what the game is trying to accomplish with how its systems are designed. I don't feel like that's what they want the game to necessarily be. When a JP does raw drive rush into crouch strong, and the fucked up hurt box makes it win against the check, and then he spends another 3 bars, and he converts into 40%, he sets up his full screen zoning, and then through his zoning, he regains all the drive gauge he just spent on that conversion. I don't feel like that's what the designers had in mind for, like, what should yield that. JP is like a good example of this inconsistency. Like, in some rounds, everything plays out like a mostly normal character. A strong character, but like a normal character. He lands some strong combos, he lands a couple stand fierce, light ghost, some spikes, some anti-airs, whatever. And he does his thing, but he mostly behaves like a normal character. But then, sometimes he gets into the right situation where it instantly becomes wildly different. Like, he has this crazy fucking corner damage or mix-up, or getting half-life off of an EX Amnesia in the corner, that literally, if it does hit a throw, it literally doesn't even cost him anything. Because it costs 2 bars to do the EX Amnesia, and then the combo he gets off of it, not only does it do half health, he regains all his fucking drive gauge in that combo. So So when rounds happen in which EX Amnesia doesn't commit a war crime, he feels closer to a normal character. But then only on some rounds, by my data of what I observed, maybe around 20% of the JP rounds that I saw of high-level matches, around 20% of them, the situation arises where he gets to express this enormous fucking advantage that he has, but only in those 20% of rounds where this circumstance actually happens and he gets to see Amnesia on a throw in the corner. That's what I mean by inconsistency, okay? That he has a huge advantage and he does this enormous thing, but it only happens sometimes under the right circumstances. And it isn't like a consistent strength that the character's always representing. You deal less damage by taking real Oki in this game. You deal less damage by being aggressive with your Oki, and you also risk a lot more because Oki you risk more in this game because the defensive options are more reversally in this game. You can get more fucked by getting perfect parried or whatever, or having some anti-throw thing get your throw. You deal more damage just fishing for random limbs to be clipped in neutral and then buffer your mediums into drive rush. Or just swinging fucking JP Stand Fierce until you get a punish counter, or DJ Funky Slicer, or any other thing that just auto-confirms YOLOs at random. You spend drive gauge, and sometimes you really spent that drive gauge, and then you're at low drive gauge and you have to deal with being at low drive gauge. Or sometimes you spend drive gauge and there's nothing. Nothing happens. You just get it back almost immediately, and really you basically spent nothing. There are win conditions that don't always occur in rounds, but when they do, they are just so weirdly balanced next to everything else. And I'm not talking about character balance, I'm talking about situational balance, like the same character. By the way, I looked at some Ultra Street Fighter 4 tournament matches as well. I didn't study anywhere near as many as I did for 6 and 5, but I did some of these recordings for USF4 matches as well, tournament matches. The average I got, the average for hits it took to end a round, okay, remember, I got 6.4 for SF6, that should be lower, okay, realistically speaking. 7.2 for SF5, that should be higher considering a multitude of factors, mostly chip damage. The average I got for Street Fighter 4 matches was 8.5, median 5, which should also be higher because those rounds also lose a lot of life to chip and gray life, like focus dash life and such. So in USF4, way more pokes, way more instances of small damage lowering the opponent's health bar. Quick pokes, quick one-button whiff punishes, quick air-to-airs, air heavy punch or something, quick one-button pokes, etc. There was some significant fluctuation. On occasion, some matches would end in 4 hits. More frequently than they even did in SF5. In SF5, a really fucked up round would end in like 5 hits. In SF4, more matches actually ended in just 4 hits than in 5, because combo damage in USF4 was really fucking high. So if it was only combos that were being landed, matches ended very, very quickly. But most rounds were 8 hits or more. Many were over 10. That is also a game where every round loses a lot of HP to chip. Like I said, combo damage at the end of USF4 was higher than in Street Fighter V at the end. It's just that the rounds were more comprised of other, smaller sources of damage. The game's damage was higher, but it was more balanced around smaller sources like individual pokes and just things that hit once or whatever. That's what I'm trying to say here. So, rounds where big combos happened ended in fewer hits in USF4 than rounds where people land their solid hits in SF5, especially given the nature of mix-ups. That's another major factor in this. Because mix-ups in USF4 could yield very high damage from like these ambiguous jump-ins into a combo for half your life, as opposed to an SF5 where you only risk dying in 3 hits if you do some drastic action like you try to tech a throw when you really shouldn't have, or you do a wake-up reversal and it gets blocked or something. But if you choose to, in SF5, you can usually die in fewer hits, even against very mix-up heavy characters. So command grabs in the game don't deal that much damage to kill you in just 3 or 4 hits. And especially if it's from like a Birdie or a Laura. And Zangief was fucking useless, so even though his command grab did more damage, it wasn't necessarily relevant as much as Birdie or Laura. Only a few characters have overhead or low mix-ups that yield to damage in SF5, and even then, it's still not as much damage as overhead low, same-side cross-up mix-ups in USF4 that you get on these like ambiguous knockdowns and stuff. So that's another reason, because the mix that you would get off of these clean combos would yield into situations that the opponent was less likely to just do something safe and survive it and thus take fewer hits. So more rounds ended in just 2 big combos and like maybe another hit or 2. But overall, again, the average 8.5, a lot higher than both other games, SF5 and SF6. In SF6, you have higher overall strike damage, combo damage, etc. than at the end of SF5. And you land those high damage combos with greater frequency, much greater frequency than USF4, where big combos only happen occasionally, resulting in the lowest average hits per round between any of the 3 games. I am too much of a fucking zoomer to have a taste of Street Fighters older than SF4. I don't know shit about Third Strike or Alpha or whatever. But from the past decade, this is the highest that Street Fighter damage has been. And this game, Street Fighter 6, mostly caters to high sources of damage while devaluing smaller sources of damage. Again, that average of 6.4 realistically should be lower once the rounds get cleaned up, once the players get more optimal and more refined and more mechanical, okay? And the USF4 and SF5 averages should be higher to take into account chip damage, life lost, and those sources. These games are not even remotely close in this regards, in terms of damage and their valuation of smaller sources of damage, thus racking up more individual hits. My point is, anyone that tells you that the game is not changing, or that if you observe something or point something out, that it's misguided and that it's actually the same as the old game because they'll show you some Twitter clip of Alex killing you in 3 hits or whatever, tell them to go fuck themselves in their raw ass with a rusty spoon, okay? The point of this video was just to report my findings and my analysis, but on a personal level, I do hope that they fucking toned the damage down in SF6. There are many aspects of the game that I find questionable and illogical from a design sense, the way drive gauge works being chief among them, and I really don't have any great love for... I don't love not having chip damage. I don't love EX fireballs dumbing down the zoning and counter zoning in this game by always winning outright against non-EX fireballs, thus always creating like this instant fucking easy switch to flip rather than making more interesting fireball wars with more interesting fireball health bars. But yes, I would like a return of risk-reward improving for smaller little pokes and checks relative to the rest of the game's sources of damage, cleaning up some of these weird inconsistencies on what yields more damage than what other actions. In fact, I've got more data collection that I have to share with you right here at the end. Tell you the other results of my data collection. On a variety of matches, I recorded how much meter was spent in each round. If we consider 2 bars of drive gauge to be equal to 1 bar in SF5, because drive gauge is 6 bars, meter in SF5 is 3 bars, a single EX move was 1 bar, 2 bars of drive gauge, you understand, right? 2 drive gauge equals 1 meter. You can debate about that, but let's say that it works like that. How do the rounds add up in terms of how much meter people are burning through per round? I mean, SF5 would certainly be a very, 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 very fucking different game if you got 8 EX moves per round instead of like the 3 that you usually got. So based on my data, in SF5, the average meter spent per round was roughly 3.9, between both players, I mean. Now, you can argue whether or not it should be between both players. It depends on how close a round is. If one person just steamrolls the other, the longer it lasts, the more meter players both generate in a single round. Some rounds are steamrollers. The aggressor doesn't need to spend that much to win, so 1 or 2 bars spent between both players in that round. A competitive round, but then usually that's also balanced out because any meter that they save in one round, they can then spend extra meter in the next round. So it balances out a bit more once you take the actual overall average. A competitive round, one usually has to spend 3 or 4 bars. Or, not one usually. Usually 3 or 4 bars are spent between both players. A competitive round 2... So that's round 1, where you start with no meter. Round 2, where both players usually start with some meter. A competitive round 2 or a competitive round 3 usually has 5 or 6 bars spent between both players. Overall, the average I got was 3.9 per round. In SF6, calculating drive gauge spent on actions like drive rush cancel, DI, and EX moves, not including whiffing parries or losing meter on block or whatever, just those actions that you take. The average that I got for SF6 was 16.4 drive bars spent per round. If we divide that by 2 to match the value of SF5 meter, we get 8.208 as the average that I got for average meter spent per round. Over double the meter that was spent on average in SF5 rounds. I suspect that collecting more data would only skew these further to their relative extremities. As for my other data, my average I got for the SF5 Pro Tour rounds in terms of round timers was rounds lasted a mean of 50 seconds for SF5. The average I got for the Pro League matches that I collected some round timer data from for SF6 gave me an average of like 45 seconds. Make of that what you will. I don't know. I didn't necessarily notice any. I was too distracted by other considerations that I was thinking about to make any meaningful insights into what the round timer would imply about either game, but whatever. And that, my good fellows, is what I have to report. After my hard work this week, I watched a shitload of fucking matches. That's about it. See ya. But by the way, I hate to be that guy. And I'm like biased and whatever, but did you notice throughout this video how like Street Fighter 4 matches and Street Fighter 5 matches are like fun and interesting shit happens a lot, and in Street Fighter 6 matches it's boring as fuck and it's just this every character and every player doing the exact same thing over and over and over forever? Did you notice that?